Hey, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. I'm so excited to be able to have a moment of conversation with you guys. And today we're going to be jumping into something that's going to be a little tough. We're going to be talking about a topic that's probably going to be tender for some of us, maybe all of us. The question we're going to be talking about is, where is God in the middle of my grief? So grab a seat, grab your cup of coffee, and let's have a conversation. As you can tell, I'm not in my typical place. I'm not in my office, in front of my bookshelf. I knew this topic was going to be a little tough, a little tender, and I wanted to get out of the office and just have a moment. Chose instead to come outside to the graveyard that is attached to the church I serve. This graveyard is an old graveyard. It's been here a long time in this community. In fact, some of the tombstones that I've had the opportunity to look at here go all the way back to the late 1700s, early 1800s. And that just tells you that there's a lot of people that have spent a lot of time grieving in this space. And it brings us to the very beginning part of the conversation, the part that is the practical part. As I've mentioned before, I think that faith needs to be a practical thing. It needs to be something that we can use every single day, something that we can put in our toolbox and take with us everywhere we go. Because there are going to be times when we're going to ask these questions, where is God when I am struggling, when I'm going through really the worst time of my life? That's where we are today. I'm sitting here, as I mentioned, in this cemetery, and you notice behind me I have a tombstone that's been erected to a family known as the Brown family. I've tried to find more of their story in this graveyard, but I don't see a whole lot of markers around me that continue the story of the Brown family. So I don't know much more other than what you see behind me. And I think that's also part of the story, is that grief doesn't ever go away, but the intensity sometimes fades in time, but we still have to go through it. The question of where is God in the middle of my grief also brings up another question, like, why do we even have to grieve at all? I ask that question a lot. I look forward to heaven when all the tears will be wiped away. John tells us that in Revelation, that there'll come a day when God will wipe away all tears. And we won't have any grief anymore. We won't have to worry about faith or hope. We'll only have love incarnate. We'll only have God. And we'll have eternity to enjoy him. And that's going to be a beautiful time. But until then, we're going to have tears. We're going to have sadness. Grief is one of those weird things. It's not easily quantified into one area. In fact, grief tends to intermingle and infect and bleed over into many areas in our life. Grief itself, if you want to just put a name to it, isn't just loss as in the loss of a loved one due to death. That's a significant portion of grief, obviously, but it's not the only thing that we grieve. Grief actually happens whenever we go through any kind of loss or struggle in our life. We can sometimes have grief that mingles with happiest moments of our life. Take a wedding, for example. Two individuals joining together, saying in front of God and their peers that they are going to love each other until death do them part. They're going to enjoy the rest of their life together. But even in that joyful moment, when the rest of their life is in front of them and they're about to jump into all the joys and sadness, but all the joys of being married, there's also loss. There's a level of loss when it comes to loss of freedom, loss of singleness. You're no longer having to just worry about yourself. You now have another individual you have to think about all the time. There's loss there. And I realize that level of grief is probably small in comparison to the loss of a mother or a father or a spouse, but it's still loss. I know seniors that have lamented and suffered loss and grieved, having to give up their freedom when they're no longer able to drive themselves around anymore, and giving up that driver's license is one of the things they grieve. Grief permeates every aspect of our life and our society. I have 4 children, and I've grieved in my heart every single time I've had to say goodbye to one of them, whether it's sending them off to the military or college, or whether it's just saying goodbye because they live in a state that's, halfway across the country than where I'm living, and I'm not going to see them again for a while. Grief is always there. Because it's such a part of our human existence, I have to say that I believe that one of the reasons why God gives us grief is so that, especially the smaller ones, it's so that we can be prepared as much as we can for when the big things come. When those big moments, when grief hits us hard, it's almost as though we're exercising and working out with the smaller griefs as we move into the larger one. And I know that still doesn't give you a good answer, and I don't even think it's the best answer I have, but it's an answer. The beautiful thing about grief is that we know that God is with us. We know that because one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament is in Psalm 34, where the psalmist says that God is close and near to the brokenhearted. And I realize that's a poetic, abstract concept. And the moment we hear that, we're thinking, oh, that's going to be great on a card, that we send somebody in the mail when they've lost somebody. And maybe that'll give them some comfort. And oftentimes we can put it in that poetic, abstract place, and we just leave it there. But I don't like to leave it there because, honestly, as I mentioned, faith has to be practical or it's useless. And I think that even in those moments when God is telling us through the psalmist that he is near the brokenhearted, there has to be more to the story than that. Fortunately, there is, because God didn't stop with the book of Psalms in sharing that passage with us. He lived it out for us in front of us. In John chapter 11, one of the most tender passages in the New Testament. It's also the shortest passage. Many of us have memorized it. Simply this: Jesus wept. But in those 2 words, some of the most profound and deeply spiritual words and concepts are given to us. You know the story, and if you don't, we'll share it just briefly. Jesus had a close friend. His name was Lazarus. Lazarus had 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. They lived in Bethany. They hung out together as a family. As far as we know, Lazarus had some sort of an illness that was going to lead to death, if not treated, or even if treated. And Mary and Martha sent a message to Jesus saying, your boy Lazarus, he's not doing so good. Jesus, we need you to come and help and take care of it. Now, Mary and Martha and Lazarus were solid members of Jesus's church, if you will. Some theologians have speculated that Lazarus was one of his supporters, because ministry costs money, and even Jesus had to have expenses. In fact, they had a treasurer in the group. His name was Judas, so that means they had money coming in. So somebody somewhere was funding this ministry, and it's more than likely that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were core members, tithing members of his ministry. And so they reached out to their man, Jesus, who had demonstrated the ability to heal multiple times to them up to this point. And they were saying, if there is anybody on the planet that you need to heal, it would be Lazarus. Jesus knew he was dying. And Jesus intentionally delayed his return until after his friend Lazarus died. And then he waited 3 days before he showed up. That's got to be tough. Now, when you're living through that story, it's different than reading about it in the past. Mary and Martha had to live through this. All of the friends and the family had to live through this mourning process as they're trying to deal with the death of their loved one and recognizing the fact that God in flesh in the form of Jesus Christ could have easily, in a second, said, be healed, Lazarus wouldn't have had to die. Mary and Martha wouldn't have had to shed their tears. They wouldn't have had to wrap his body and stick it in a tomb. They wouldn't have had to go through the process of saying goodbye to the brother they loved. And when Jesus showed up, all that emotion was there. The whole family was grieving in a powerful way. And Jesus, Scripture tells us, Jesus saw the emotions on the people gathered around that tomb, and he began to weep as well. Now, I've told you before, I'm not going to drown you in Greek and Hebrew, but you have to know that that word wept in Greek is not simply a tear, gently coursing down his cheek. It's not even 2 tears. It's not his eyes getting all watery. It's full on, smack dab, ugly, nasty, snot-filled crying. Jesus bawled because he was experiencing the grief that his friends and family were going through, and it caused him to grieve, even though he knew that in minutes he was going to take all that grief and turn it into a transcendent moment of joy when that brother was going to be brought back out, and that grief that they were experiencing would be delayed because, well, Lazarus was going to die again, just not that day. Jesus was telling us in that story, in that scene, that when we go through the deepest, darkest part of our grief, he will be with us. That's powerful. So he said it in the book of Psalms, he lived it in the Gospel of John, and then he promises us in Revelation that he's going to wipe those tears away. That's pretty powerful. So if you ask me, why do we go through grief? I give you a lot of answers. I don't think any of them truly answer it when we're in the middle of it. Sometimes we have to come to that answer on our own, and it has to be a journey as we go through it. I've talked about some of my griefs over the years, and over the past few episodes, I've mentioned a couple of them. As I've said before, my mother and father passed away soon after each other and not that long ago. And I'm still going through the process of grieving that loss. It's not easy. My mother, who was a hospice nurse and was very good at her job, while she was caring for a patient, that patient slipped and fell on her, causing her to fall back and damage her neck. In fact, it crushed one of the vertebrae in her upper neck area and caused an incredible amount of pain. The solution then, in the same way now, is that they would go in surgically and fuse the neck bones so that the pain would be relieved. When the surgeon went in and did that, he accidentally cut a nerve in my mother's neck, causing a chronic, absolutely horrible pain in my mother's body for the rest of her natural life. And it was hard. For the next 20-something years, my mother had to go through this crippling pain, dealing with serious medication, narcotic medication to cover the pain up, but never really went away. I watched my father, who had recently retired from the military, as they were expecting to experience life together in this retirement time frame. My mother, who was just really a few years away from retiring on her own, and I don't know if she ever would have fully retired. It would have been something she probably would have dabbled in, and I watched my father grieve that loss of their dreams. I watched my mother grieve the loss of being able to be a nurse as she clung to that nursing license for years, even after the injury, when the government told her that she would not be able to practice her craft. She still held on to that license in the hopes that one day she would. And she asked every day that God would heal her. And every day, God did not. And that was a painful thing. I watched my father's body deteriorate to the point when my mother finally did pass away, he was a shadow of his former self. And I watched many of his dreams of what he wanted to be and do in his retirement years pass away. And within 2 years, about a year and a half or more after my mother passed, my father passed away as well. This was tough. One of the deepest and most hardest things that I've had to experience in that whole grieving process was shortly after my mother passed away. I had had the opportunity to see her face to face, and we were able to work through some of our frustrations that we had with each other. And I had to go back to my life. And I lived at the time in Alaska. My second son was going through boot camp, and he was nearing his graduation time. And my mother was living in New York State. And I didn't know when she was going to pass. I just knew she was going to. And so we went home and waited and waited. And these things never happen at a good time. And oftentimes they happen at the worst possible time. And it did for us. I had to come down to Chicago to celebrate the graduation of my son from boot camp. And it was actually the evening after my son graduated from boot camp that we got the message that she had passed. And I had to send my family back to Alaska because we just couldn't afford for all of us to stay down there. And then I took a train from Chicago to Syracuse, and I had to do it rapidly because my mother, her wish was to be laid to rest in a natural cemetery against the wishes of the family, but this is what she wanted, so this is what we did. Consequently, my mother would not be able to be embalmed, and so we couldn't have a viewing. And I had to hurry because every day that my mother was stored, her body, her physical remains were stored in the mortuary. It was expensive, and we had to get there as soon as we could. My cousin, her husband was a carpenter, is a carpenter, and he had built a casket for my mother, and she had the opportunity to see it before she was laid to rest, and she was pleased with it, but it was a simple affair. It had to be in order to go into that ground. It couldn't be a typical casket. It had to be something that was made of wood, something that would degrade. There couldn't be any metal really in it. And so um, he made it with dovetail joints and I think a little bit of glue, and that was it. And I don't even know for certain if there was glue that was used. And I managed to get there just in time. We pulled up to the cemetery, and we had to carry my mother's casket about 250, almost 300 yards to where she would be laid to rest. And this was in the spring, around Mother's Day, a little before. And in upstate New York, there's a lot of snow. Fortunately for us, the snow had been melting out, and there wasn't that we had to contend with, but it made the ground really wet and muddy. And so all of us are carrying this casket from hearse to the hole. And the whole time my brain is thinking weird, crazy, grieving thoughts. And I just had this weird vision of us stumbling and tripping and dropping the casket. I had weird visions of us shifting and tilting and my mother's body shifting inside the casket because there's not a lot in there. It had to be natural. It was mostly just her body and her sliding to the end and popping out those dovetail joints and her slipping out of the end of the casket. I was scared to death of that. In fact, after it didn't happen, but after the funeral, I've had multiple nightmares of that event happening. It was tough. And I still am grieving over this. It's been over 7 years since I've said goodbye to my mother. And I never had a chance to say that to her face, her body, after she died. My brother, my sister, my father, all of them were gathered around her, but I wasn't able to be there because I had to go on with my life and we didn't know when she was going to pass. And it was hard. Hey guys, so I had to pause the video and just take some minutes to, just process some of the things that those memories had brought back. And in fact, it took more than a few minutes. It's definitely a different time of day. And consequently, I decided to go ahead and move to a different spot in the graveyard. And I'm now in front of the headstone of a gentleman that was laid to rest in 1888. And his name is John Walker. It's grief is one of those subjects that just isn't easy to talk about. And it's not easy to um, to bring it back up when in some ways you feel like you've got it settled. It's been over 7 years since we laid my mother to rest, and there's just a lot of history there. And when those memories come back, and I'm intentionally channeling them back out, especially to talk about them, it takes it takes a bit from me. And so, and I know I'm not unique. I know other people feel the same way about their own grief, and I'm sure there are some out there that have experienced far more than I have. But that's the thing about grief. It's not about comparing. It's not like my grief is bigger or badder or worse than yours. It's about how much each vessel that holds it can contain it. What I found over the years that the best way to deal with grief, because you can't just dump it out, because it just doesn't pour out like that. Um, the best way to do it is to slowly leach it out, to tell your story often, to share with those that matter to you the memories that hurt. Because when we push them down and push them aside, or we trample on them in an effort to be busy, we don't do the memories justice, especially when you're dealing with the loss of a loved one. And I know primarily that's what we've talked about today, although grief takes, like I said, many forms. But this is the penultimate. It's the big one. It's the one that we struggle with the most, more than a lost job or missed opportunity or a loss of status. It's a big one. So, in light of that, one of the things that I share with people when I am officiating funerals, whether it's counseling with the family after the funeral, or even before, or maybe just talking to friends and family, or when I'm on the stage sharing as the family is about to head to the gravesite. I always encourage the friends and the families to push past what I like to call casserole time. There's that point, usually about a week or so after the funeral, when the casseroles stop coming and it almost becomes like radio silence. And part of it's our own fault because we don't grieve well. We don't know how to grieve. And consequently, we don't know what to say because we have this weird feeling that silence is to be avoided. And so rather than let that silence exist between two people who are in the same space, we just avoid that space. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we weren't created in isolation at all. We were created for connection. We were created in the image of God, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That eternal dance between the three of them that's self-contained, complete, filled with love. We're created with that same desire for community and connectivity. And I don't care how much of a hermit or an introvert you are, you still crave connection on some level. And when you're going through these kinds of times, the instinct that our culture drives and beats into us is to isolate, keep it secret, keep it safe, don't share because you don't want to show weakness or whatever. And that's the wrong thing to do. We're created for connection. We're created for community. And I encourage the friends and the family and the people that are in the congregation at the funerals to reach out after the casserole time is up, to connect with their friend or family member who's gone through this kind of loss, especially around those precious times like anniversaries, holidays, special moments. That gives the individual that's going through the grieving time the permission to grieve, and it allows them to know they're not walking this journey alone. Jesus tells us that he's going to be with us. He says, I'll stick closer to you than a brother. He says, my yoke is easy. My burden is light. He expects us to walk together. In the great high priestly prayer, as is recorded in the Gospel of John, he specifically says that the world will know his disciples by the love they show one another. It's easy to love when it's good. It's hard to love when we don't know what to say. And one of the things that we say in the chaplain world is that there's a ministry of presence. Even if you don't know the right things to say, sometimes just being present when another person is grieving is enough. So I encourage you, if you know somebody that's going through it and you don't know what to say, that's okay. Reach out anyway. Let them know you're there. Swing by for a cup of coffee. If you have to feel like you bring something, bring something. A tray of cookies is never rejected. Do what you can to reach out to those that are hurting. If you're going through grief, if you're struggling with it and you're wondering, how can I make it just the next day, the next step, the next whatever, I put together a workbook. I wanted to have a tool that I could give to family members and folks that I knew were grieving that would be a resource, not a quick fix, not an end to the grieving, but sort of a next step. I've titled it Still Walking: 15 Days Through Grief and Loss. I'll put the link in the description if you want to look at it on Amazon, but again, it's just a tool to step through the next few weeks or days as you're thinking, how am I going to do this? If you are going through it, or if you've gone through it, and maybe there's some things that you've learned, maybe there's ways that you've learned to be able to leach some of the toxic grief, if you will, out of your system. And if you have a method and you want to share it, drop it in the comment section. If you just want to share some of your story, drop it in the comment section. If something that I've said resonates with you, or you know somebody that might be going through a tough time, I encourage you to send them a link. Let them watch the video. Maybe something that I say will inspire them to take that next step, to keep walking, to keep moving forward down that path. Because that's the thing you got to remember, is every step matters to God, even the ones where we're not really stepping. I've mentioned in other videos, sometimes our steps with Jesus are steps backwards or steps sideways. And that's okay, because every step we take matters, and every step we take, he's there. We just got to retrain ourselves to feel his presence. So I encourage you, like and subscribe it. Hit the little notification bell so that when we have these videos pop, and I try to put them up on Thursdays, you'll be notified. And I really want to carry this conversation on. In the coming weeks, we're going to talk about this and other things, and some of them are going to be light and fun. Some of our conversations will be like this, tender. But whatever the conversation is, we need to keep it real. We need to keep it honest. We need to create a space here for that level of authentic honesty where we can have a true dialogue, and we can remind ourselves that our faith and our theology needs to be grounded in reality. Now, I appreciate you taking time. I appreciate you giving me grace to be able to pause, collect my thoughts, and come back. Until the next conversation, keep the coffee hot, keep the faith real, and keep the conversation honest.